Hello, everyone. Welcome to the UCLA Undergraduate Research Week. My name is Cate Bonesho, or Cate Bonesho. I'm a professor in the Near Eastern Languages and Cultures Department, and I'm delighted to help with Undergraduate Research Week here at UCLA. So I would like to thank everyone at the UCLA undergraduate research community for being with us today during our 4th annual virtual undergraduate research week. We are thrilled that all of you could join us during this speaker series as we highlight the different paths that undergraduate research can take you on. So today, for our Research Week speaker series on creating new knowledge, we have Erika Draze joining us. Erika Drazen graduated summa cum laude from UCLA in 2012 with a bachelor's in arts degree in anthropology and minors in art history and geography and environmental studies. While at UCLA, she participated in the Lemelson Anthropological Honors Program. Her honors thesis was on environmentalism in the Scouts of Australia. Erika received her Master of Environmental Science and Master of Business Administration at Yale University, and she has researched women's inclusion in forests and climate change projects for her master's thesis. She has also assisted on research examining how to scale up sustainable development projects, as well as on research exploring how evidence can be incorporated into international development policy and implementation. She spent the past 4 years working at the World Wildlife Fund in Washington, D.C. on environmental and social safeguards. She recently joined the USAID as the Accountability Mechanism Official. Her research and work centers around themes of environmental and social justice and improving outcomes of international and sustainable development efforts. So please join me today in welcoming Erika Draze.
Thank you so much for having me here to talk with you today. I don't really know how I got thrown in with such great speakers in this undergraduate research week, but I hope you'll enjoy my talk and be able to learn something from it. This talk isn't about a particular body of research, but more of a survey about how I've used research throughout my career and a summary of the findings from my various research projects and how it influenced my work in sustainable development, protecting the most vulnerable and marginalized people and environments. So UCLA is very near and dear to me. My 2 sisters are also Bruins, and my dad was even on the Parents Council. So some of my other affiliations at UCLA, you can see on the slide, were the Film and Photography Society. I was a student educator at the Hammer Museum. I was on Student and Alumni Association for all 4 years, and I worked at the Challenge course. And so happy to talk about any of those experiences as well. So the skills and perspectives and experiences that I gained while at UCLA really have laid a foundation for my career for the past 10 years. I came to UCLA as a freshman undecided, and I took my first cultural anthropology course, and I just fell in love, and I wanted to major in it. So anthropology, for those of you who don't know, has 4 kind of subfields. I think it's illustrated by this shirt that I received from the UCLA Undergraduate Anthropological Association. There's archaeology, cultural anthropology, linguistic anthropology, and biological anthropology. I was able to take courses in all of these, and they range from doing an archaeological dig in Peru during one of my summers to studying street performers in Santa Monica to doing conversation analysis during pre-production for one of my films in FPS. And so I really love anthropology because it feels like you can study almost anything. But perhaps the experience that best prepared me for my master's was being a part of the anthropology honors cohort, also known as the Lemelson Scholars. If you're an anthropology major interested in research, I highly recommend you look into it. My cohort studied everything from chimpanzee mating behavior in zoos to rave culture to drag queens to Viking archaeology. So it's a really diverse and varied topic. You can see some images from my research here, and in the corner is the Lemelson Scholars class of 2012. So the Lemelson Scholars Program was like doing a master's thesis in undergraduate. It's a series of 4 courses that goes from winter quarter in junior year to winter quarter in senior year. And the first course is proposal writing. The second course was methods. The third course, well, then you do your summer research. Then the third course is data analysis. And the last one was writing. So throughout this course, I learned to write proposals, go through the rigorous process of IRB, which is the Institutional Review Board, which grants approval for research on human subjects. I learned how to apply for grants and funding and conduct research, analyze data, and write my thesis. So as I've said, you could study almost anything with anthropology, and we got to design our own research project. And so I knew I wanted to do something at the intersection of studying humans and the environment. But for cultural anthropology, you have to conduct interviews and do participant observation. So you need to be very familiar with the language. And so I was only comfortable conducting interviews in English. And so so basically I knew that I could probably get some funding to go abroad and do my study there. So I was deciding between UK and Australia, and I decided to go to Australia because I knew someone I could stay with there, and that could keep my research costs down. And so incidentally, I'm very glad I did go to Australia because I actually ended up meeting my husband during conducting my research. So the title of my research was Green Thoughts and Inaction, the Perception, Utilization, and Conservation of the Environment as Influenced by the Institutions of Government, Family, and the Scouts of Australia. Quite a mouthful. But basically, I'm trying to see my research. So I researched the Scouts of Australia and whether or not their principles of environmental stewardship actually translated to more environmentally friendly behavior. So through interviews, participant observation, focus groups, I learned that the answer was not really. While the Scouts cared about the environment, they didn't always act in any more environmentally friendly than anyone else. And so while I was analyzing this research, I called it the thought action gap or the ideology behavior gap. I later learned that kind of this thinking is the field of behavioral science. And so the social norms that individual family units and the hassle factors that arise from the lack of government support for sustainable living often hampered their efforts to live in a more sustainable way. So some lessons from my undergraduate research. So I learned a lot. It taught me how to listen, how to be open-minded and not make any assumptions, how to ask the right questions, and how to relate to people from different backgrounds and cultures. I learned from both my undergraduate and my graduate research that if you believe enough in what you're researching and you can write proposals well, you can basically get anything funded. So I also learned that writing is a tedious process and you have to have a lot of perseverance and self-control. And then specifically from the topic of my own research, I became interested in behavioral science and why people don't do what they want to do, and also how this plays out within organizations. And so I learned, and you'll see also through my research later, that when you're trying to create change, it's important not just to think about technical solutions, but human behavior and what the enabling conditions are, as well as what are the barriers that need to be removed in order to create that change. So from here, I continued my studies in environmentalism, sustainable development, and climate change. And from my research, I learned the types of things I like to do and the types of things I didn't. So for instance, I really loved talking with people, conducting the research and the analysis, but I wasn't such a huge fan of writing. And as you can see, this is kind of, that diagram is basically just showing, fuel is the enabling conditions and friction are the barriers to, creating this change. All right, so after graduating, I got my first taste of international development when I spent 4 months in India interning for the World Wildlife Fund as part of a social justice fellowship. The office I was in Hyderabad, so it was a state office, not the national office, and there were only 6 people in that office, but it had to run the whole scope of the entire activities of a nonprofit organization. So the work I did ranged from coming up with a corporate sponsorship program for fundraising to nature education for high schoolers to conducting an assessment, a livelihoods assessment of villagers near a tiger reserve. And so I was able to practice the skills I had used in my undergraduate research when I got to interview villagers of a local tiger reserve and find out their concerns about living near the tiger reserve and how they, which alternative livelihoods they would like to develop. So I loved, doing this work. I loved international conservation and international development, but I knew I wanted to go back to graduate school. And so actually I was looking into what to study. I was thinking maybe international relations, but then my mom actually sent me the link to a profile of a professor named Michael Dove at Yale, and he leads the Yale School of Environment's PhD program that's in correlation with the anthropology department. And so, those are kind of two of the things I studied at undergrad, and I was really excited to hear that this joint PhD program existed. And I never heard of the term social ecology before, but I knew that's what I wanted to study. So I reached out to talk with him, and he was kind enough to meet with me. And he told me that most people don't go straight to a PhD, but that they do the master's at the Yale School of Environment first. So I applied to that program. So part of the reason I wanted to go to graduate school was that I realized even though I care about environmentalism, I didn't know much about the actual science of the environment beyond introductory courses from my minor. And so while at Yale, I got to take courses on silviculture and agroforestry, ecosystem ecology, tropical field ecology, and carbon budgeting. But as I said, the main reason I was there to specialize in environmental anthropology. And so the Yale School of Environment has amazing faculty. I worked with Michael Dove, who you can see in the bottom left image. He was my advisor, and Amity Doolittle when I was there. But since I've been there, Yale, the School of Environment has actually created a concentration in environmental justice, and they've hired additional staff that are in this field. So it's exciting to see that. Quite a few of my classes spoke about conservation or international development and how even the most well-meaning organizations and projects could end up not achieving their desired impact or do more harm than good. So to demonstrate this, this is a book actually that I was assigned in one of my classes in my master's program. It's a children's book. Well, it's in the format of a children's book, but it's basically kind of a satire on on international development more broadly. And so I have the book with me. I was thinking it could be interesting just to read a little bit. I have some images on board, but unfortunately they're from this book's website and they're a little blurry. So I was just going to read a little bit to you. But so it says, if a man is hungry, don't give him a fish. Give him a rod and teach him how to catch one. If a man is hungry, don't give him a rod. Show him how to make one in his own environment. But if a man is hungry, don't let him ruin the environment. Teach him to protect it while still meeting his needs. And so it goes on like this, and I don't know if, you can't see the book on my screen, but basically it goes through the whole international development process. So it says, so if a man is hungry, first assess his needs, then train some local trainers. Draft a first report, conduct a quick appraisal, organize a workshop, agree on clear objectives, and decide to meet again. But if a man is hungry, don't forget advocacy, don't forget participation, sensitivity to local cultures, and the sustainable mainstreaming of gender. And don't forget efficient fundraising to replicate your experience on a much larger scale. Always keep your commitment to the hungry man. There's so much you can do. for each other. And so, when I'm reading it out to you, you can see that it basically sounds a lot like what international development organizations do. And in some ways, that is good. But in other ways, it might not be meeting the immediate needs that are there. And so I thought that this book was quite funny and kind of true of some of the issues that we were studying in our classes in my master's. So just an example of, a project that was well-meaning but didn't necessarily reach its objectives is called the Play Pump, which at first sounded like a great idea, but it ultimately was deemed an international development failure. So the idea of the pump was, and you can see in this diagram, that there's a little spinning play wheel for children to play on. And when they played with that wheel, it would pump water, and then the community can draw from that and use it. And so when this was first introduced, it got a lot of publicity. It was on Frontline on PBS and had many, big name investors. But as I said, it ultimately didn't work. And there'd been a lot of analysis of why it didn't work and what went wrong. But the long story short is that a lot of these pumps sat unused. And this is a public failure, and ultimately, actually, they did pivot and were able to provide clean drinking water, and they refocused on schools. But a lot of international development actually has a lot of these failures that go unnoticed or unresolved, and the international development community doesn't systematically learn from and iterate on its mistakes. So I wanted to look at how international and sustainable development could do better, how they can learn from their mistakes, listen to communities, particularly marginalized voices within those communities, and create lasting change. In the fall of my first year, I attended a conference, and this is a photo from the conference, on women's inclusion in natural resource management. And after the conference, I emailed 14 different organizations that had attended to ask if I could spend the summer researching women's inclusion in natural resource management within their organizations. So one of them actually agreed to let me do this. It was the UN RED program. And so I was going to spend my summer in Sri Lanka looking at women's inclusion in RED+. And so for those of you that don't know, RED+ stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. So it's a way to keep carbon stocks in forests in developing countries while contributing to sustainable development. So at the same time that I was going to conduct this research, I had been doing an independent study with the United Nations Development Program, Global Environmental Facility Small Grants Program. It's a whole mouthful. But so basically they provide support and technical assistance to projects that conserve and restore the environment while contributing to sustainable livelihoods. They give grants of under $25,000 to community-based organizations to do projects, but they wanted to look at when they had a successful project, how that can be upscaled to multi-million-dollar global environmental facility projects. So I was also, at the same time I was doing my research on women's inclusion, going to be doing this research on upscaling of projects. The nice thing was when I started taking classes on social science research before I went to do my research, I basically had all of this experience from my undergraduate research that I could pull on, and applying for IRB approval and designing the methods were a breeze. So as I said, for both of my summer research projects, I conducted a literature review, key informant interviews, participant observation, and focus groups. I went on site visits to different projects and spoke with project participants. I was embedded within the UN RED program in Sri Lanka, and I went into the office every day unless I needed to be at the SGP office or I was on a site visit. So being in the office meant that I got to see the dynamic between the national office and kind of regional or international consultants. Oftentimes the consultants would come into the office for a couple days to a week and then provide their advice and then, return home. And so I saw the tension that this created between the national office and international consultants who often didn't have the time to understand the local context. And I thought to myself, I really enjoy being in this office and contributing and being there daily. And I would never want to be the person that just flies in and flies out. But now I kind of am that sort of person. So we'll get to kind of how I reconcile that later in this presentation. So I just wanted to mention some interesting findings from my research on women's inclusion in RED+. So some of the findings were that women participated in natural resource management projects and activities much more at the local level. They had a large presence, came to meetings, and often led initiatives. But at the national level, there were not many women at all. The CSO platform, which is a body of CSOs and NGOs that are dedicated to working on RED+, they had a quota for 2 of positions out of their 7 on their head committee to be women, but they only had 1 woman there. And the reason wasn't that they didn't want someone else, but it was that no one else was willing to join or take on that responsibility. And so it just shows that even when people want to do good, usually enabling conditions themselves won't help. You kind of have to remove the barriers and points of friction. So some points of friction in this case were that women couldn't travel far from home, often because they needed to take care of the children. So one way to remove this barrier would have been to provide childcare at the meeting facility, or to provide a travel stipend that they could use for childcare at home, or something to that effect. Language was also a barrier for participation. A lot of the meetings were conducted in English, and the local languages there were Sinhala and Tamil. And so women spoke English at a lower rate than men, and so it was difficult for them to participate unless they knew English. And the last point was that even when women came to workshops, they didn't feel comfortable participating or sharing their perspectives and their experience. And so we found that breakout groups and good facilitation helped enable them to feel more comfortable sharing. So as for my SGP research, aside from national interviews, I conducted 5 site visits to different project sites. These projects worked on everything from reducing persistent organic pollutants to reviving Russian reed conservation through traditional basket weaving to raising traditional tuber varieties for markets. We identified and examined 6 pathways for broader adoption, namely replication, upscaling, mainstreaming, sustaining, markets, and diffusion. And some of those findings were that all projects were upscaled through at least 2 different pathways, which is why they were successful at upscaling. They didn't just rely on one. Another reason that we found projects were successful in upscaling was because Sri Lanka had a strong civil society, and so a lot of the projects had very dedicated champions that would see the projects through. So when I was done conducting this research, I wrote up the findings, and I applied to and presented it at 4 different conferences. And so that was the American Anthropological Association annual conference, the conference on South Asia, the conference for the Society for Conservation Biology, and FLARE, which stands for Forests, Livelihoods, Assessment, Research, and Engagement. And so a lot of the people that presented at these conferences were PhDs or professors, but it was helpful for me to present at these conferences because it helped me understand what life as a PhD would look like and what I needed to take to present. But in addition to presenting at these conferences, I also wanted to make sure that the research I conducted actually helped make a change in the organizations. And so I presented to the UNDP team in Bangkok about the RED+ findings, and I presented to the SGP team in New York about my findings. So that was kind of my research from the Yale School of Environment side, but I actually also got to participate in research as part of my MBA program. So part of the reason I wanted to pursue the MBA was to learn how to run organizations to help them achieve their mission. And I took classes like nonprofit management and social entrepreneurship, along with the more traditional MBA courses. So I mean, I don't know about you, but when I went into business school, I didn't realize like it was a research institution, but it obviously is one. It's got PhD students and professors just like any other part of the school. And so I was lucky enough to be a research assistant on a project that really shaped how I thought about international development more broadly. And how I got to be a research assistant on this project was that I was looking to figure out how the RED program in Sri Lanka could create more institutional memory, because this was one of the challenges that I saw when I was doing my research. And so, that's a question for organizational behavior, and I sought a professor that could help me answer that question. So while I didn't find anyone that explicitly could answer that question, I met two professors, Rodrigo Canales and Tony Sheldon, who you can see in the image on the bottom left. They were conducting a research project with the Hewlett Foundation looking at how to understand the conditions under which rigorous evidence can be effectively integrated into public policies and NGOs' practices in the field of international development. So that research project, I was working on it for 1.5 years. It went on for 3 years. And so I got to be there when it started, though. So it was a great experience. We started with an initial round of expert interviews of people, including everyone from academics, government officials, foundation program officers, NGO practitioners, and think tank directors. Secondly, we conducted a matched comparison of 8 cases of development programs or interventions where rigorous evidence was integrated with varying degrees of effectiveness. The third component, conducted in parallel to the 8 case studies, consisted of interviews with prototypical representatives of each of the stakeholder groups. So the second component was case studies, and each of the RAs, including myself, took a case study. So I got to look at a case called Aqua Plus in India. So I got to return to India and use a lot of my research methods that I had honed to understand this case study. And so what I found was that the case showed that, so Aqua Plus is a effective and very affordable water purification solution, but it wasn't selling like it should on the open market. And they were really targeting bottom of the pyramid customers. So the case showed that, when marketing new products, it's not just enough to tell people about the health benefits of the product, but you have to consider the behavior change as well. And so, for instance, there was another product that basically delivered clean water to people's doorstep. A lot of people were more willing to pay for that than this product because of the convenience of it. They didn't have to, walk far distances and pick up water from a well and carry it all the way back. And so they initially just kind of focused on the operational aspects of how to get this product out without thinking about how to create demand for the product. So all of these case studies and the interviews and the workshops led to a number of findings across these 8 case studies about the international development ecosystem and the actors within it. So these were kind of the takeaways from this research. So we found that there were often misaligned incentives, both within an organization and between organizations. So this could be something like leaders wanting to announce a flashy new initiative without checking with the people who are actually going to implement it, if it's feasible. We also found that there were disparate definitions of evidence. And so that to some people, evidence was only a randomized control trial, and that was the standard for evidence. Other people, took a more holistic approach and looked at randomized control trials, A/B testing, kind of more interviews or focus groups as well. And even just practitioner experiences all kind of became part of a body of evidence. And so you can see on the slide, the topics under the from are kind of what we found and the issues. And then the to is where we thought the international development field should get to in order to be able to better incorporate evidence into policy and practice. So for timing misalignments and lack of trust, oftentimes, donors will provide funding on a 5 or maybe if you're lucky, a 10-year cycle. But these issues that we're tackling in international development are incredibly complex and take 15, 20 years, if not more, to really make headway on and resolve. And so that often led to organizations really just going for short-term wins because that's what they could report as successes to the donor instead of tackling bigger challenges. We also saw that fear of failure was something that was evident. And I mean, it seems fairly obvious if you're talking about how you failed in a project, how are you going to get funding for your next project? So, that was oftentimes cited as a reason why people didn't learn because they didn't know about these failures and they didn't discuss them or critically analyze how they could do better next time. And the last thing we found was that in a lot of cases, there were champions that carried the evidence through into implementation or into the policy. And, that is great. And they were incredibly dedicated and hardworking. But the issue is that what if they left the organization or what if they burnt out? It's not a sustainable model to just have champions, but you need to create structured collaboration and systems and processes to be able to incorporate this more fully and not just rely on, amazing individuals. So all of that research was conducted during my master's program. And, but I decided that, I had wanted to do a PhD, but I really wanted to actually take this evidence and incorporate it. And so I decided to leave academia and to, just work in international development field more broadly. So since leaving academia, I've worked for Climate Advisors, which is an organization that works to strengthen climate action in the US and around the world. The World Bank, which is an international finance institution that provides loans and grants to developing countries. For the World Wildlife Fund, which is where I've spent the majority of my time since graduating, which is an international conservation organization that works to help nature and people thrive. And currently with USAID, which is a federal government agency that administers civilian foreign aid and development assistance. And so just to note, this presentation is being given in my own personal capacity and is not affiliated with or reflects any USAID thoughts. So I've really enjoyed a lot of the work I've done in my career, but in my career, I don't really get to do a lot of in-depth research and analysis. I don't get the luxury of spending a lot of time in the field, and I really need to be able to do quick research or find evidence, taking the broader definition of evidence and research and not, a very narrow definition to be able to inform the work that I do. So for instance, I spoke about how I saw the international consultants coming in and advising the local office. But so in my work, in order not to just fly in and fly out, when I was at WWF, I created monthly meetings with my counterparts in the countries where we worked so we can build rapport, establish relationships. I can help them troubleshoot on any issues, and I could also know what was going on, so I wasn't, completely blind to what was happening in the project. And that way, when it came time to go for an annual supervision mission, it felt like we already knew each other and there was the rapport there. From my anthropological studies, it taught me to consider issues from other people's perspectives. So for instance, in my role at WWF, we were a nonprofit and we received money from donors that had particular requirements. So many of the times our offices in the country were extremely overworked and they were implementing projects and having to do these onerous donor reports. And so understanding their experience helped me think about ways that I could help me meet our requirements. So I wanted to create those enabling conditions. And so I tried to make it as easy as possible by providing guidance, by giving them templates to fill out so they didn't need to start from scratch, or providing PowerPoints for them to share when they go to the field with project participants. And so additionally, kind of just thinking about considering things from other people's perspectives, it helped me figure out how to communicate with different stakeholders, whether or not it was, someone in government wants to hear different things than someone in the field or a donor does. And so figuring out how to tailor my message and what was needed to the particular audience was something that I found helpful as well. So I also learned that you can spend a lot of time and money trying to design a perfect solution. And oftentimes, you want it to be just right. So you interview a lot of people and stakeholders and meet technical specifications and you roll it out. And, as we saw with the play pump, it can fail. And that's not because you didn't try. But I learned the most important thing was to have a learning mindset. And my professor of innovation during my MBA program like to say this phrase, fail early and often. And that what that really means is just iterate and learn from your failures and don't take anything as the final product. You can always keep improving and to create better impact and more impact and better outcomes. And with that, it's also important to stop and reflect on how things are going. Are we achieving the desired impact, and are we having any unintended impacts, either positive or negative, and what should we be doing about them if they are negative? I also learned to think about the sustainability of the project, not just environmental sustainability, but also how the project will be sustained after, or how the impacts will be sustained after the project closes, and how to keep the benefits of the project going. So part of this is, it gets to the discussion about having a champion and how, they may lead the organization. And so you want to set up systems and processes that, can help the people that are left know how to implement the projects and know, what works and what doesn't. And so, the ways that I've incorporated this into my work is that I've, come into organizations before where there isn't much of file management, and a lot of people keep things on their own computer, or they don't share documents with other people. And so when I came in, there was not really much for me to learn from. And so I try to, make sure that everything is public, that I create guides and templates and project tracking information. So that way, when I leave, people can continue on doing that work without kind of an interruption to the project or the services they're providing. So lastly, I just wanted to address advice for getting a job in sustainable development. I think it's really important for you to work abroad. Going to India really helped me, and then also being based in Sri Lanka really helped me get the different perspective. It proves that you're willing to work in those places and spend time and understand the issues. Learning other languages is also helpful. If you want to work around the world, it would be good to communicate with people around the world. And staying up to date. So what I mean by that is, if you're working in international development, it's helpful to stay up to date with the latest current events and also the industry publications, like ISD's briefings for sustainable development. And that way, when you're going to an interview, you know what's going on and can speak to those topics. This was something I didn't know going in, but deciding to be a specialist or a generalist is something that sometimes you can do both, but oftentimes you kind of need to walk a specific path. And so, specialist is really knowing that technical subject matter. So that is, climate change or gender mainstreaming or things like that. Or if you want to be a generalist, you can there's a lot of different roles that you don't necessarily think about, like fundraising or communications or project management, where you don't need to know the specific details of the technical side of international development, but you still get to be involved in helping with the mission. Another thing I would recommend is not being afraid to ask. I mean, as you've heard, I asked to speak with Michael Dove, who became my advisor in my master's. I reached out to organizations that were at that conference that I went to, and UN Red said I could do work with them. The worst, I applied to speak at all those conferences, and not too many people were master's students, but I got to speak, and that was a really awesome experience. And I think what I'm trying to say is there's no harm in asking. The worst they're going to say is no. And so I recommend you just ask and go for it. The last thing I would say is that networking is super important. It's meeting new people, but also figuring out what type of jobs are out there. If there are any jobs coming open soon, that's helpful. Networking, the Bruin network is huge, so really use that to your advantage. And I have, when I've been looking for new jobs, I definitely reach out and have informational interviews and chats. And oftentimes you'll find that people are very willing to take 15, 20 minutes of their time to speak with you about what they do or how you can get involved. And so that's my advice for getting a job in sustainable development. And that's it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Erika, for sharing your journey and your experience from LA. And I really appreciated the last slide of looking forward and advice to undergrads doing research at UCLA. So we have time for questions. So if you have questions, please do ask them in the question and answer feature on the Zoom. We do have some questions from that were given to us ahead of time. So we'll start with those. But again, please feel free to ask your own in the question and answer feature. So our first question, Erika, is, can you share any advice for applying to graduate school?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, it really helps to reach out. So speaking with Michael Dove helped me to get a better sense of what they were looking for in the program and how I could best position myself. I could bounce research topics off with him, and that was really helpful. But I think what's really important is to first figure out where you want to go and what you want to do. Like particularly in graduate school, you're working closely with professors, and so you need to really think about who's a good fit, like who is actually, you may be thinking, and I looked at quite a few different environment schools when I was applying, but and I looked at the different professor CVs, and this one just, spoke to me, and that's why I wanted to go there, was because of the specific professor. I also think that when you're looking at applying to graduate schools, it's helpful to basically think about like what you want to do as a result of it. Whether or not you want to go into academia, or you want to, go into, become a practitioner, as we call it. If you have that idea in mind, it kind of tailors the experience. Like there are some things that I wish I would have taken if I had known that I was going to be going into becoming a practitioner. I might have done things a little bit differently. So, I mean, your ideas can change in graduate school, but I think when you're applying, like reach out to professors. Oftentimes they have introduction or they have info sessions. Reach out to the admissions people and talk with them as well. And also a lot of the things that informed my graduate school experience were the programs and centers. And so that the work that I got to do, that work study I got to do while I was there, really gave me experience in the field, because I was only out for 2 years in between undergrad and grad.
Wonderful.
I'll stop there.
Thank you. Our next question is, do you see environmental, social, and governance as a future investment trend?
Yeah, so I think in a lot of ways, ESG criteria are already really being considered and are here. I know there are a lot of different task forces or ways that people are thinking about, particularly on the environmental side, how to include reporting on these things and thinking about how they impact, like have a monetary effect on investments. So for instance, there's a task force on climate related financial disclosures. And so that's working to have companies report on any climate risks that they have in their portfolios. And there's also the task force on nature related financial disclosures, which is coming in later than climate related disclosures, and trying to do the same thing for valuing nature and what that does to your investments.
Thank you. Our next question is asking, what are common misconceptions about sustainability implementation?
That's a great question. I think that I've touched on some of them here, and I think, like, you know, working at the intersection of conservation and international development, you know, oftentimes conservation is a very like scientific endeavor, and it says, you know, if we can just achieve like X, then, you know, the tiger population will rebound. And I mean, actually the tiger population has rebounded, but in general, oftentimes it didn't look into kind of how humans can make that difficult, or what are the negative impacts of, you know, tigers rebounding on humans. Like there's more human wildlife conflict. And so I think, you know, it oftentimes, you know, there's, when we're in sustainable development, you're focusing on health, or you're focusing on gender, or you're focusing on education. And there's, when people are designing projects, they're working to achieve a specific objective within one of those and not thinking about how it may impact other kind of sectors within international development.
Wonderful. I'm learning so much of this as someone who studies the antiquity. So our next question is, what is the best way to get better at writing? And I might add, because you said you didn't enjoy it as much at one point in your presentation, maybe to start enjoying writing more. This person says, I've heard reading is one answer. Are there any other practical exercises that you found work too?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I find writing a little bit difficult to get into, but there's times when I do get in the zone and really have, you know, like get down to work and get into deep focus. And I think that creating the time for that is really important, like setting that aside on your calendar, particularly, you know, if you're working on a master's thesis or a PhD, there's not always a deadline per se. Reading does help. It's helped me expand my vocabulary a lot, and I often look at papers to see how things are conceptualized, to, you know, take that into account when I'm writing my own papers. And yeah, I mean, I think, as you said, I used to have a better, I used to love writing more, and I think in some ways it kind of made it less fun when I had to do so much of it for academia. But I actually recently took a creative writing course because I did want to get back into it and, you know, enjoy it more. And so I think things like that, like making it fun or doing something that's not related to the objective you're trying to accomplish, can also make it more enjoyable.
I think that's really, really great advice. I often find the same for me for writing and also reading when you do it so often. Yeah.
Yeah.
A next question we have, I'm so sorry, is, do you see a PhD as a possible next step at this juncture?
Yeah, so that's something that I've considered. I would love to do a PhD at some point in my life, but one of my professors at UCLA, actually, I don't know if she's still there. Her name is Professor Toyota. She was in anthropology, and she basically had a career as a journalist for 20 years and then came back and did a PhD in his teaching. And so I'm thinking at this point, that's probably more my model. Is I'm enjoying working as a practitioner, and I'm advancing my career, and I really would love to do a PhD for the sake of diving into that research and getting more knowledge. But I think that might be something further down the road, and it's not in the immediate future.
Wonderful. If I may ask my own question, if that's okay with you, Erika, I know you mentioned that you were originally undecided when you came to UCLA, and that you took an anthropology class and fell in love, and that kind of led you on this path. Can I ask why you took the anthropology class in the first place? Was it an accident? Were you interested a little bit in the already?
So it was the GE requirement that I was fulfilling. It counted towards one of them, and it's a while ago, so I don't remember exactly which one it was, something in social science. And so I took it and I really enjoyed it. And yeah, that's why, I proceeded to major in it. I think I see another question about my contact information. So, I mean, you can feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way to get in touch, and we can go from there. I am always happy to talk with students. I've talked with quite a few people about grad school and read their essays for Yale School of Environment, and so yeah, I'd be happy to chat more if you're interested. So yeah, just look me up on LinkedIn and yeah, we can have a chat.
Wonderful. And then last, it appears that we have one of your former classmates giving you a shout out, who's seeing you today. So in the
Yeah,
question and answer,
I see.
are there any other questions that anyone has? If so, please do ask it in the Q&A. If not, I just want to thank you, Erika, so much for this past hour or so. I've learned, and I know that the audience has as well. And I have so many more questions to ask and want to learn more. So thank you for joining us and speaking to our undergraduate researcher community. And thank you for answering their questions. We're really grateful for sharing your rich journey of both research and professional development, and your unique insights to research and sustainable development. I'd also like to take this time to thank UCLA's research community for joining us today and asking some pretty fantastic questions during our time with Erika here. And then finally, thank you to our faculty, supporters, and staff of the undergraduate research centers on campus for this virtual undergraduate research week. It wouldn't be possible without you. And if you haven't already, please do check out the pre-recorded pieces for Undergraduate Research Week that are available online, and join us for other events as well. But thank you again, Erika. It was a pleasure to speak with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Take care.